The Holy Gospel this evening comes from St. Matthew in the 6th chapter. Now, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. Rather, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consume and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. So during this season of Advent, we're waiting for Emmanuel. Emmanuel means that God is with us. And as we're waiting, we're taking a look at the places where God is with us in our lives, as we looked at a few weeks ago, in our homes last week, and this week looking in our hearts. That is, that God is with us, not only walking with us in this place of life, in this world that we live in, but God also resides deep within all of us. And there's a story, and in order to get to a little bit about how important this is, I want to tell you about a story about a little boy named Johnny. Now, John, when he was about in the middle of about 11 kids, and he was about 4 years old, didn't have all of his younger siblings yet, but there was a massive fire in his house, and he was able to escape by jumping out a window with his mother, and he did lose his father in this particular fire, and so he was raised by a single mom and 11 kids. Now John and his next younger brother, whose name was Charlie, John and Charlie were pretty good kids, all in all. They went to school, did the things they were supposed to do, and lo and behold, decided that when they both got done with school and that they'd been kicking around for a year or two, they decided that they would try to become ministers. And it wasn't easy to be a minister in those days because you actually had to go to school and learn things, and neither one of them were particularly brilliant at school and doing all that kind of stuff, but they toughed it out, and they made it through their classes together, little John and Charlie. And so then they got, they finally got a chance to be ordained and pastors, and their church asked them to go be missionaries. And they said, well, sure, where are we going to go? And they said, well, we're going to send you to the colonies across the ocean to a place called Georgia. And their first call was in what is now present-day Savannah, Georgia. And they built some churches there, and up and down the coasts of present-day Georgia, North and South Carolina, they were quite good at it, and they made names for themselves. It turns out that although John and Charlie were not great at school, John had a way of words, and Charlie knew a little bit about music. And they were done doing their missionary work, and they decided to go back to London, see their family. They'd been away for about 4 years living in the colonies. And they came back to London, and John was walking down a street, and it was called Aldersgate, and there was a chapel on Aldersgate. Every street in London in those days had its own chapel, and there was the only church was the state church, the Anglican church. And as he was walking by this chapel, he heard a preacher. And the preacher was talking about another famous Christian from years earlier, actually 200 or 300 years earlier. He was a guy by the name of Martin Luther. And he was talking about Martin Luther and the book of Galatians. And John stopped and he leaned back against the door and listened to this preacher tell the story of this Martin Luther guy that he knew a little bit about, but hadn't really spent too much time worrying about him. He was a German after all, and how much do they really matter? And so he listened, but he felt something for the first time in his life. Although he had been a minister now for almost 7 years and had done a lot of great things, for the first time he said that when he was listening to these words of Luther about the book of Galatians, he said his heart felt strangely warmed. His heart felt strangely warmed. And young John ran back with his brother and met Charles, and together they began to write some new songs, some new hymns. And John and Charles Wesley, the two men who founded what we call the Methodist faith, the two men who wrote about 30 of the hymns in our hymnal, were strangely warmed. And their Christianity, although it had been part of their life or for most of their lives, it was when their hearts were strangely warmed, where the gospel of Jesus Christ had entered into them at a level where it was no longer about the business or about making churches, but it was about creating songs that could talk about God. That we could have songs of praise that could just flow off our tongues. We wouldn't have to think about it. The words would just kind of erupt out of us like a volcano because we loved God so much. And it was that strangely warmed heart that John Wesley felt that was so important to what he understood, so that he could say, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumph of his praise." So there is an understanding that when Christianity strikes us at this deep level, deep within inside of us, that we will change and we will be transformed and we will be guided in ways that we couldn't even imagine or begin to see. And that when we find ways that we can live out this gift that God has given us, when our hearts explode out of us, we can do superhuman things. Now, for those of you who, for John and Charles Wesley, might be too strange of a metaphor, then I bring you none other than the Grinch. He's a fine one, Mr. Grinch. But you know, I grew up, of course, with the original Grinch with Boris Karloff, and Chris and I happened to actually watch it the other day. You know the whole point of that story, right, is there's the Grinch, and there's the Who's down in Whoville, wah-hoo-dore, and he hates that. And quite frankly, I can't blame him. But there it is. And he wants to somehow say to himself, wow, this just doesn't work for me. And so he goes and he tries to steal Christmas. He takes the flip-flobbers, the hoop-knobbers, the bows and the ribbons, the things, and he even takes the crumb that's too small for even a mouse. You know the story well. But then, of course, Christmas Day arrives, and the Who's, without any Christmas trees, without any presents, without any roast beast, gather to sing. And in that singing, the Grinch on the top of Mount Crumpet changes. And the way the story goes, his heart grew 3 sizes that day. That when the Grinch's heart, filled with whatever Christmas was about, he broke out and was able, with his superhuman strength, to actually return Christmas back to Who and Whoville. But his heart was changed. Like Wesley's, whose was strangely warmed, the Grinch's heart grew, and in growing, he began to see what it was really about. Because you see, what we do here, what we do around this font with Tenley, what we gather around this table, why we light the candles, decorate the trees, give the gifts, eat the cookies, eat some more cookies, have a couple of cookies later on, and then a couple more right before you go to bed. We do that because Christmas is about our hearts growing in love and trust. From the gift that God has given us in the baby in a manger, our hearts grow so that our love can transcend our own bodies, begin to bring us into places that we would never go, to allow us to do things we would never even think of doing. That Emmanuel, God with us, is there to guide us so that we can do the impossible. Love people that nobody else can love. Say hi to those that everybody else is too afraid to say hi to. Be a friend to those who don't have any. And so as we gather together to prepare for this birth of Christ, with Christ in our lives, don't forget to take stock in the next few days of yourself and your own heart and its relative size to what you want to accomplish in your life. Because there is always room for a bigger heart. There's always room for more love. There's always room to find one strangely warmed. And as Jesus reminded us so long ago, if you find your treasure, you're going to find your heart. When you find that which is valuable to you, when you find that which brings you joy, which brings you peace, whatever the good of this season is about, whatever expectations you bring to Christmas or Advent that you want to see finally happen, that treasure that you're searching for is where your heart is. And maybe it's in the shy smile of the girl across the room at the party. Maybe it's in the giggling laughter of a new grandchild. Maybe it's in the laugh of a good friend over a good beer. Maybe it's holding hands with someone you've been holding hands with for a long time. However Christmas comes, it comes in us, not only to warm our hearts, but to enlarge them with the gifts of love and hope and peace. Because finally, Emmanuel is not about just making things easier in this world. It's about making the things in this world that are difficult lovable. Things that we don't like about ourselves and our world have value because they do to God. And it's as true for you as it is for the Grinch, as it was for John Wesley. The love that God has for you warms God's heart. And to see you is to see the heart of God expand 3 sizes each day. Amen.